Welcome to session number 15 of this series on philosophers in the midst of history. We do one ancient philosopher in the spring, and then we do a medieval philosopher in the late spring, early summer, and then we do a modern philosopher. We're doing Jean-Jacques Rousseau today in late summer, and then finally in fall, I guess you'd say November, right? It's not yet winter. We do a contemporary or 20th century thinker. So we're doing Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and as we were talking about before this, he's a rather contradictory fellow, very fertile in the things that he wrote. I don't think that you can actually manage to fully integrate all of his ideas together into one coherent body of doctrine, but that's okay because people have picked up on his ideas and used them for so many things, and that's part of what we're going to talk about. So in these talks, and by the way, I encourage you at any time to ask questions or if you got comments, we can always come back to topic if there's anything that's unclear. But in these talks, I always like to sort of situate the philosopher in his or her history, in the sense of the development of what's going on, where their life fits into the bigger picture of what's happening. But I also talk about how they then come to influence history, because it's a back and forth. It's very rare that you have somebody who's just totally a creature of their times and doesn't help to shape their times, and sometimes afterwards. Rousseau, he has a lot of effect in his own time, but he probably has even more effect shortly afterwards in the French Revolution. So what I thought we'd talk about first is just the context that he is growing up in and living in and working in. He's definitely a creature of the 18th century, and we call that, in English, the Enlightenment. The French call it the siècle de lumière, which means the century of lights or of illuminators. And the Germans call it the Aufklärung, which also has this sense of illuminating things. And I didn't put in on the timeline all the different people who are doing interesting Enlightenment work at the time, but you can think about all these figures, some of whom don't like Rousseau, like Voltaire. Voltaire is from an older generation. He and Rousseau never get along, although Rousseau likes him quite a bit. Voltaire never liked Rousseau. And then you've got people who are closer to him, these encyclopedists like Denis Diderot, his friend D'Alembert. Believe it or not, they were also in this sort of circle with one of the Grimms. And there were other people engaging in important political ideas like the Baron de Montesquieu. You notice that even one of the big texts that made a lot of money for its writers during that time. It's a little bit where is it? It's in 1732. Benjamin Franklin writes Poor Richard's Almanac. So it's not just on the European continent. It's also, people are writing in America as well. There's a lot of back and forth happening. And so I thought we'd talk about that first. And I think it's impossible to talk about the Enlightenment in general without noting the growing dominance of two countries. One is England. England had become a center of culture by the turn of the 18th century. As a matter of fact, somebody who doesn't manage to get into that, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the sort of the universal genius of Europe in the late 17th century, is very, very sad because he doesn't get to go to London like the rest of the Hanover family, because he didn't do his job that they hired him for, which was he did all these other things, but he didn't fulfill his obligations as family historian. So they left him behind when they went to London. But Leibniz had gotten to go to Paris, which was the other major cultural center. And in the 1800s, Paris retains that status. And some of the other countries in the 18th century, that were quite powerful at the start and whose stars are sort of waning would be like Spain, for example. Sweden also. Sweden had been a massive power in the 17th century. They played a huge role in the wars of religion, but eventually they're not quite as important. In the East, there's really three main powers that are becoming important to focus on. One is Russia, of course, and then there's Austria, and then Prussia. And so you're getting these nation states developing within Europe, and nation states, they require a lot of apparatus. They need working civil services. They typically have some sort of national culture that they're trying to forward and to some degree control. We're going to talk about some of the controls on that in France that affected Rousseau. So he's born into this context, but he's born in a different place. He's born in Switzerland. And Switzerland is this kind of, thorny little upstart, mountain-locked kingdom of a whole bunch of different fairly independent cantons, each of which is kind of doing its own thing. One of which is actually involved with Prussia at the time, that we're going to talk about. And being born there, and being born particularly in Geneva, which is in the French-speaking part of Switzerland, Rousseau is getting a very different upbringing than, say, somebody who'd been born into France or Prussia or England. And that's going to color his views, and it's also going to open up possibilities for him that might not have existed for others. There's a lot of wars going on here and there as these powers spar with each other. There's this continual emphasis on sort of centralizing power, generally against the nobility, who don't like that sort of thing. In France, they actually distinguish between two kinds of nobility: the noblesse de l'épée, which means the nobles of the sword, the old warrior types who hold land from their feudal conquests, and then the noblesse de la robe, which means the nobles of the gown. And why would they wear a gown? Well, they were, somebody in the civil administration. So it's possible for the rising bourgeoisie to become part of the state apparatus of power and to start affecting policy and changing the culture. And, the aristocrats didn't really like that. So you have this constant back and forth in the 18th century between these kings and their civil services, and oftentimes the bourgeoisie lining up with them until the kings spend too much money, and then the nobles, and then you've got the church as well involved. And there's a lot of entanglements there, not just between the church and the state, but also given the fact that some of these nobles are holding their titles from, religious endowments as well. You find all these people who are the abbé in French, or the abbot in English, of such and such a place, and they never go there. They're just drawing the rents from it and living at court and doing their thing. And I suppose the other thing to say politically too that's quite important is Louis XIV, who's pretty much gone by the time Rousseau is a kid. Louis XIV managed to really centralize power in France and to defang the nobility, in part by requiring them to be at court. And he reigned for a very long time, too. So when you've got that kind of power for that sort of time, you can really start to change not just a culture, but the politics of what's going on. A few other things that are happening that, before we get into the intellectual scene, trade is booming all over the place. As a matter of fact, some of the wars that they're having are over trade. So you've got not only these massive nation states, but also mercantile powers. You could think of like the Dutch, for example, or the Portuguese, who are going to play a role until they kind of get shuffled off the scene. And they're getting to know the world far better. You could think of the 17th century as an era of exploration, lots of exploration going on of South America, North America, and parts of Africa, all sorts of trade things established with the East Indies, with China, with India, and that sort of thing is getting consolidated by the 18th century. People know where things are on the map. Except for, if it's really deep in the heart of, South America or Africa, maybe they haven't penetrated that far. But for the most part, they know where things are. Now it's a question of how do you get the commodities from there to here reliably without, piracy taking it over or your rival mercantile powers taking it. So they're all jarring with each other over that. And they're getting to know not just about the cultures of these people, but about their ways of life and their modes of thought. So, just for an example, the Catholic Church, the Pope was the one who ended up deciding this. They had to decide that Christianity and Confucianism were indeed not compatible with each other. Because when the Jesuits went into China, the Jesuits were, translating the Bible and Christian writings into Chinese, and so they were trying to find concepts that would work. So, God becomes Tian or heaven, which is not quite the same thing as the God of the Bible. And, the Jesuits always were a little fast and loose with that sort of thing during missionary work. And eventually, word gets back basically from the Franciscans, who are like, these Jesuits, look at them, what they're doing. And they get condemned, and they get told, get out of China, You're no longer allowed there. We're going to send in more reliable people. But why are they doing that? Because they need to make sense out of the fact that within China, you have this massive body of thought that really does seem to make sense and offers a way to understand, the human beings and their hierarchies and the divine and everything else. And so that's part of what's going on in the 18th century, is this confrontation with other ways of looking at things. And that's very liberating because, if you only have one way of seeing things and it seems to make sense, you might tinker around with it a bit, right? You might say, well, this part doesn't really seem to work anymore. Worked great in the 12th century, but doesn't work great in the 18th century. But you're probably not going to radically revise it, right? But when you have other models, you can be like, well, why is our model the correct one? Maybe we should, really think about this stuff. And so you see, for example, Montesquieu writing the Persian letters. It was kind of and Voltaire does this sort of thing too. It was quite popular to say, hey, I met this guy from this land here, and they do things differently. Isn't it weird how we do things this way? Maybe we don't have to do things this way anymore, which is a rather progressive way of attacking traditional structures and beliefs and things like that. And so that was quite a common thing that they would do. In the Enlightenment, there's, we're talking about intellectual life. So, and it is something that belongs to an elite. It's not the ordinary person on the street who is really engaging in this, although literacy is becoming, more and more common. And more books are being printed, and more broadsheets are being printed as well. You can just tack up to a wall and have people read, sort of like we've got Twitter and message boards and stuff like that. That's what a broadsheet essentially was back then. You'd go to the tavern or coffee house, and you'd have your big, almost like a poster, saying the mayor sucks. Here's why. He's a terrible guy, and he spent the money on this and that. Or, could be, this book is great, or we should think about this idea. And people would communicate with each other that way. So even the ordinary people could get involved with it, but they weren't the drivers of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is still being driven by an elite, but it's no longer an elite of nobility, and it's no longer an elite as it was in Western Europe of an educated clergy. Because, if you think about who the elite were, who were, driving culture in the Middle Ages, it was mostly the clergy. Now it's secular people who might be philosophers, or they might, bill themselves as geometers, or they might bill themselves in all sorts of other ways, political thinkers. But they're engaging with each other and engaging with ideas and proposing new ways to think of things. And from the perspective of anybody who was, sort of rather traditional at the time, which could be everybody from those wanting to maintain political institutions the same, to those who are concerned about the guilds going under, to those who are worried about things for religious reasons. All of this Enlightenment activity is kind of dangerous. It's undermining people's long-held views. It's calling things into question, right? So Rousseau is going to be part of that. But as we were talking about at the beginning, he's not an Enlightenment figure in the same way that some of these other people are. Like if you contrast him to Voltaire, for example, Voltaire tends to look at things in terms of a fairly straightforward account of human progress. And Rousseau, it's a lot murkier. There's a lot of ways in which progress is bad for us, as we'll talk about. But on the other hand, we can't just stay rooted in the past that we've had, or just maintain a static present. So part of what they're trying to figure out in the Enlightenment is really a couple big questions. One is, what is human nature? What is it that how do we understand human beings? What is it that makes us what we are? Do we need to look to the Bible for an account of that, or religious authorities for an account of that? Or do we take a different attitude that's less beholden to those? I mean, they'll still talk about God a lot, but it's kind of a abstract God instead, right? A sort of a deist watchmaker's God. They're really interested in, well, how do we develop? And you notice that Rousseau, if you look at some of his texts, is talking about how human beings evolve. He doesn't use the word evolution, which is more of a 19th century thing, but he's talking about that. He's not talking about necessarily genetic evolution. He's talking about how do we as a species become more and more complex and more distant from our origins. And whether we're developing in the right way as well. That's another key issue for him. And he's not the only person. So you've got these accounts that people are providing, talking about primeval states of nature. Some of this goes back quite a ways to Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. But now they're starting to use the anthropological materials that they've got. They can do cross comparisons. They don't have to speculate about the Native Americans. They've got 100 years of people writing about them, oftentimes from biased perspectives, but better than what Hobbes had to work on, and better than what John Locke had to work on. And they've also got these accounts of what people do in China or India or in other places, so they can use that for doing sort of cross comparative studies. The other thing that they're really, really centered on is the question of society. Who should be running things, and how should they be run? And you could say that, I don't know if you can say that feudalism ever really worked that well, that effectively in Europe. It worked good at the time, I guess, better than some of the other.
For some of them.
Well, every political system works great for somebody. Right? Hegel has this great quip in I think it's in the Philosophy of History, where he says he's contrasting the sort of what he calls the Asian spirit and the Greek spirit and the Christian spirit. He says with the Asian spirit, and of course he's generalizing here, only one man can be free, the guy at the top, right? And then for the Greeks, a few can be free, the ones who are at the top as well and aren't slaves or non-citizens or something like that. And then under Christianity, everybody can be free, So he sees this kind of evolution. Obviously, that's an idealization, right? But you can say that one of the things the Enlightenment thinkers were really interested in is that movement. How do you go from a few people being the ones who are free in the sense that they can enjoy life and decide what kind of life they're going to have and get to participate in political deliberations and determinations? How do you go from just a few to many without everything falling apart? Because, I mean, you could imagine these guys looking around at the populace and saying, we want that guy to vote? I don't know about that, How do you do that? Well, one way is by changing the nature of the people that you've got to work with. So if you can, remove prejudices and superstitions and get rid of government corruption, and all, you see where this is going, right? This is the same thing that we say today. Oh, if we could just get people to see clearly where their true interests lie, then our politics wouldn't be so toxic. If people just weren't so prejudiced and rooted in their ways, whether on left or right or even in the center, we could all get along and figure out what to do about, say, global climate change or the threat that China is posing, or what we're going to do when AI and robotics takes all of our jobs, or any of these sorts of things that our political system is clearly incapable of actually handling, right? So, I mean, the Enlightenment figures, you can see where they're coming from. They didn't have, 300 years of people trying to do that and it not working out like we do. Or we can say in the present, they tried the French Revolution, that didn't really work out as planned. Our American Revolution culminated in a political system that in some respects was really great at the time, but now is sort of like a Model T Ford, where we're constantly replacing very old parts that don't seem to work very good, and people are zooming past us in their, modern Fords or Lexuses. They didn't have that. They could actually dream of what if we actually did, in fact, remove the scales from everybody's eyes? And they saw for the first time that the right thing to do is to say, maximize the positive outcomes for everybody and minimize the harms. Wouldn't that be amazing? And so there are a lot of thinkers who propose things like that. And along with that goes sort of a critique of religious institutions and arbitrary political institutions. Why do we have to have a king? Does that seem to be the most effective way of governing, to have this hereditary monarchy? Now, saying stuff like that could get you thrown in jail, right? And some of these guys did, quite frankly. But you can see that it's creating an environment in which Rousseau's thought can flourish. And we can say that the 18th century, after the death of Rousseau, it really culminates in one massive event, which is not the American Revolution, it's the French Revolution. Because France was a more important country at the time, really at the center of the West, and it turns everything topsy-turvy. It creates this animosity of all the other powers against France, generates, what would we say, 2 decades of constant war, and also creates some breathing space for our project over here. I don't know that the War of 1812 would have gone quite so. I mean, it didn't go well for us, but I think it could have gone way worse if the British, weren't fighting the French at the time. The French Revolution is quite important. So let's talk about Rousseau's life, and I created this timeline for you to give you some of the high notes. So he's born in Geneva, and he's a citizen of Geneva, and that's important because it means that as opposed to being born in France, he would have been subject to the King of France. He's subject to the much smaller state of Geneva. His mom dies shortly after childbirth, and his father Isaac, and there was a bit of a disparity there too. His mother is from sort of the upper class. His father's a craftsman. And his father brings in his sister to help raise the boys. Doesn't take too long before they relocate, and they end up living in this craftsman neighborhood. And Rousseau gets some of his ideas about, the value of handiwork, as opposed to being, an aristocrat from that. And that's kind of important for him. I think quite a few of these Enlightenment types could be, rather abstract about that sort of thing. Rousseau actually knew what it was like for people to work. And another thing that was really cool that his father did. Now, his father's kind of a, good guy, bad guy sort of figure. But one of the good things that he did is he had all these books that were, I think, essentially the property of his dead wife. And he starts reading these with young Jean-Jacques and teaching him how to read. And then they read the books together and they discuss them. And that's part of how Rousseau ends up getting, the first beginnings of his education. He, in the Confessions, and unfortunately, you want to talk about an unreliable narrator, you really can't trust everything that Rousseau says in his Confessions, right? And that's one of the main sources we have for his life, is his autobiography. But he says that, he read all these novels and fantasy works, and he's modeling himself after people in Plutarch's Lives, So if you think about the reading, if we were on our own and we didn't have elementary school or middle school, and we just had a bunch of books and a dad who was actually willing to read them with us and talk with us about them, that's probably a pretty decent education, right? We could have gone much worse. Imagine if it was all just, Army field manuals or romance novels or, mercenary novels or something like that. Now, eventually, his dad gets into a conflict with a landowner over hunting, and he has to get out of town. He and his sister move to Nyon, and they leave Jean-Jacques behind with his uncle. And his uncle houses him with a Calvinist minister just outside of town, a really strict guy. Eventually, Jean-Jacques gets apprenticed to a notary, then to an engraver. The engraver beats him. So he's learning quite a few things. His craft, beatings are awful. And he runs away from Geneva to Savoy. And there he meets this Catholic priest who introduces him to one of the first important women in his life, Francoise de Warren. And she is a, what would you call her? She's sort of like a religious headhunter. She's out there looking for conversions. She was originally a Protestant, and so she would travel around and she'd give you the soft shoe, they call it the soft pedal, approach. White Catholicism is so great, you should convert back. And she and Rousseau are going to become involved. But before that, he actually converts, and he gets disowned immediately by his family. Then he becomes eventually the lover of de Warren. And he starts studying philosophy and mathematics and music, and he's actually quite good when it comes to music. He writes a dissertation on modern music. Eventually, he receives a small inheritance and then partially repays de Warren for her support. And he's becoming independent now. He becomes a tutor in Lyon in 1739. 1742, he moves to Paris, and he's got a new idea for musical notation. And he presents it to the Académie des Sciences. They say, no, this is very smart, but it's not going to work. And he was hoping he'd actually make his fortune with this. But being in Paris, he meets this guy, Denis Diderot. And Diderot is one of these Enlightenment intellectuals. Diderot is going to be involved with this massive project called the Encyclopedia that we'll come back to in just a bit. Encyclopedias, I'll just say this by side note. I mean, did any of you grow up with a world book in your family, or an Encyclopedia Britannica or something like that? I used to read them all the time when I was a kid. You just open up to an entry and read about it, and it was really cool. And you had the overlays, like in the coal mine, you could see where the coal comes from, or I'll tell you a funny story too. So when I was a kid, I started reading pretty early. I learned to read when I was 3, and then I just started reading stuff. And sometimes I wouldn't associate the words that I knew, I guess you'd say orally, right, with the words that I was reading on the page. So I came downstairs one time, and I was telling my mom I'd been reading an entry on dolphins, and I was telling her about their stomaches and, what went on with this organ. And I didn't make the association. That's the stomach, right? I was pronouncing it, the way it seemed it should be pronounced, stomach, right? Because that's the way it's written. And my mom was like, "What the hell are you talking about? What's a stomach?" And so I pointed on the page, and then by the time I pointed it, I realized where things had gone wrong, But it's a sign of how much we took the world book for granted, So we'll come back to that in a bit. He also then becomes the secretary to this ambassador to Venice. And so that gets him to Venice, which is quite interesting. It gets him, to see what's going on with that. Unfortunately, the guy, the ambassador, typically wasn't paid for his own work for more than a year after he did it. And there was a trickle-down effect. He doesn't get paid, his servants don't get paid. So Rousseau wasn't getting paid either. And Rousseau, after waiting a year to get paid, was like, I'm not doing this anymore. So he comes back to Paris. Then he becomes involved with this woman, Therese Levasseur, who's she's a servant woman. But clearly he was quite taken with her because he got her pregnant 5 times over the course of his life. Every single time, he and her mother convinced her to give the children up to what was called at that time a foundling hospital, which really means an orphanage. And there's a lot of dispute about this. There's some people who say, well, that's basically, given the infant mortality of the time and the way these things were run, that was basically like, a death sentence for the kid. If they survived, they were probably pretty lucky. He never did. 10 years later, he wanted to find his son. He wasn't particularly interested in daughters. Then he couldn't track anything down. Nobody knew anything. But he was, he was quite taken with her. She will play an important role later on. Around that time, he writes a letter introducing himself to Voltaire. Voltaire, doesn't give him much of a response. Shortly after that, in 1749, he wins a big prize that kind of puts him on the map. He writes the Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts to fulfill this prize contest for the Académie de Dijon. And that's the first of his discourses, and that's where he's sort of laying out some of his ideas about human development and politics, and how the different activities that we do, like the arts, change our nature over time and change the structure of society. Meanwhile, I should probably start talking about some of the things on the other side. Around this time, Montesquieu is publishing The Spirit of the Laws. Diderot gets jailed for a while under what's called the letter de cachet, meaning hide him away. And Diderot and D'Alembert, shortly after Rousseau is publishing this Discourse on the Sciences and the Arts, they begin publishing their encyclopedia. They had written a prospectus for it about 5 years before that, trying to raise money. And the whole idea with the encyclopedia. So now let's talk about the encyclopedia. We think of an encyclopedia as, well, it's this set of books. You buy them. Maybe you buy it on installment, $100 a month or something like that. They're in houses. There's some in the library over here, right? You got, the World Book for kids. Later on, you look at the Britannica or the Americana, or what are some of the other big ones? And then there's, encyclopedias online that you can buy or buy them in CD-ROM. But it was really a revolutionary thing at the time. And Voltaire earlier had actually written or is that later on? No, later on he writes a philosophical dictionary. Writing dictionaries or writing encyclopedias at that time was a subversive act. Because it's not just that you're making knowledge available to people. You get to write you get to write the articles how you want them. And you decide what goes into it, what counts, what needs to be in there. So imagine if you write an article on monarchy. And you say, well, there are many different, kinds of monarchies, and then you include a paragraph on, some people think that monarchy actually is not that good and probably should be replaced with something else, Or you start writing on religious topics, and you say, you don't even have to come straight out. You can say, some people have the idea that all these miracles that the saints are supposed to have done, those are just natural occurrences. I'm not saying I endorse that, but, some people think this is reasonable. And here's the arguments that they use to explain this, right? So the way that you do, or you can also, of course, be very, straightforward. There are no miracles. Pierre Bayle was a person who wrote encyclopedia entries, and he would say stuff like that in an earlier time. So putting together an encyclopedia like this is a big deal. It's a lot of work, right? But it's also something that makes it possible for people to have a common vocabulary and imagine a different world and discuss it with each other. It provides a basis. So Rousseau will write some entries for the encyclopedia, and so will a whole bunch of other people as well. Coming back to Rousseau, he writes a comedy called Narcissus, or the Self-Admirer, which in some ways could be, disguisedly autobiographical, right? Because I think he's a little bit narcissistic. And then he composes an opera. And this is a really kind of curious thing. So his opera gets performed for the king, Louis XV, who is sometimes called Louis the Beloved. People liked Louis XV. Things were, there were a lot of things that were screwed up in his reign, but for the most part, the people tended to like him. The first part of his reign, actually, there were two sort of competing figures, because he's crowned king when he's 5 years old. So obviously he can't rule. The Duke of Orleans is the regent for a while. And then you've got this guy, the Cardinal de Fleury, who becomes quite important as well. And anyway, having your thing performed for the king, well, that'd be like having your opera performed for the president, right? And then the king offers him a pension, basically saying, I'll set you up for life. You can just, do your thing, and you're obviously very talented. And Rousseau refuses. He turns it down. And everyone's like, what the hell is wrong with you? It was partly because he wanted to maintain independence. And eventually he's going to return to Geneva, and he becomes a Calvinist again. And then he in 1755, there's two important discourses that come up. One of which he writes for another prize competition, doesn't win it. That's the discourse on the origin and basis of inequality among men. That's one I typically teach, in which these handouts are drawn from. And then the discourse on political economy. He gets involved with another woman, the Madame d'Épinay, who's fascinated with him. She has a cottage, set up for him that he calls the Hermitage out in the countryside. And then he falls in love with this woman, Sophie Dudot. That leads to a quarrel with Madame d'Épinay and Diderot and Grimm about what's going on. Rousseau is a person who gets into quite a few conflicts of that sort, and eventually he leaves and he starts traveling around again. Then he writes Julie or the New Eloise. And that one, his other things had made him some money. You can make some money printing things out. Julie made a lot of money for him, as did Emile or On Education as well, which comes out the next year, as well as what's considered to be one of his most important political works, Of the Social Contract. And we're going to talk about one of the key ideas from that in part leads to the French Revolution and also gets Rousseau vilified as a proto-fascist later on, called the general will. Now, around this time, there's starting to be more crackdowns. And the Encyclopedia, the permission to publish it is revoked. They continue publishing it in secret. They claim that it's being published in Switzerland when it's actually being published in France. Because in Switzerland, the French, parliament and king and clergy can't touch you. But if you're publishing it in France, then you can get in a lot of trouble. Meanwhile, the Parliament of Paris, and the Parliament is the nobles, right? The Parliament condemns Rousseau's book Emile, and they make out a warrant for his arrest. Voltaire actually offers him refuge, but Rousseau doesn't take his offer up. He flees to Bern in Switzerland, and then after the Bernois tell him, you need to get the hell out of here. We don't want you here. He goes to Neuchâtel, which at that time, I'd mentioned there was a connection between Prussia and Switzerland. So Neuchâtel is actually ruled by Frederick the Great at that time. There were quite a few little patchwork things all over Europe where like this monarch would have like this little province here. And so the fact that it's ruled by Frederick means that Rousseau can get some refuge there. He eventually relocates to this other place, the Ile de Saint-Pierre, then to Strasbourg, and then he goes to England. And in England, he's going at the invitation of David Hume, who's a very important philosopher today, less known for philosophy at that time, more known for his historical work and for his literary and artistic criticism. And he's tied in with a whole bunch of intellectuals, and through that, Rousseau is reunited with Therese, and then eventually he gets into a dispute with Hume. And to get into a dispute with Hume, you got to really be a jerk, because Hume was a really, really easygoing guy. We've all got like friends who will put up with just about anything, and they always look on the better side, right? Well, that's Hume. And Rousseau, managed to even get on Hume's nerves. And he also starts writing the Confessions at that time. And Rousseau is a big enough name that Hume is actually quite worried that he's going to show up in the Confessions, which is going to be a tell-all, and that it'll make Hume look bad. So there's that whole affair going on. He goes back to France under an assumed name and begins suffering from some severe paranoia and anxiety. He starts moving around, sometimes with Therese, sometimes not. Eventually he marries her, but he marries her under a false name, so it's an invalid ceremony. He finishes his Confessions in 1769, but he doesn't publish them at that time. As a matter of fact, they're not going to be published during his lifetime. What he does with them is he goes around and does public readings. Sort of like, we have that at bookstores today, right? An author will come in and they go to Boswell's and, you drive downtown and Upper East Side, right? And you go there and they're sitting there and they've got their chair and, they read a chapter or something. They got their books for sale in the back. And then, people come up and they say, oh, you're so wonderful. And, or, what were you doing in this chapter? Or they ask, the really questions that they think nobody's ever asked. Where do you get your ideas from? Right? And then the author, gets out of there after about an hour and a half after selling 10 books or something. So Rousseau's readings were not like that. It was quite common back then to have readings of books. And one person who recounts Rousseau's Confessions readings, and I'm laughing as I'm thinking about this. He says, I was used to like going in and listening to a reading for 6 hours or so. This was 14 hours. And then here's the kicker. It was very long, but it was really such a wonderful work that the time just flew by. Can you imagine sitting there for 14 hours listening to this guy read his book and recount his life and tell you his thoughts on things? I have a hard time picturing that. I don't, I've had days where I had to teach 9 hours, where I had to, lecture and discuss things for 9 hours during the day. And by the end of that day, my vocal cords, because vocal cords are really muscles, they would be sore and swollen, and I could barely speak at all. It's like when a person has laryngitis. And I'd be like drinking tea and, using Ricola all day long too as well. I can't picture doing that for 14 hours, And he did that 4 times. The thing that brings it to an end is the Madame de d'Épinay, who figures as a character in there, sues because she doesn't like Rousseau airing her dirty laundry in these public readings. So that puts the end to that. And he gets involved in a few more political writings, the Constitutional Project for Corsica, Considerations on the Government of Poland. In 1776, the year of our revolution, which really begins in 1755, but gets really going, he gets injured. He gets knocked down by this Great Dane. There's actually like a carriage coming and a Great Dane, and to get out of the way of the carriage, he gets in the way of the Great Dane, and it knocks him down, and he has a concussion. And people who read about it think that he probably had neurological damage as well, because there were some other things going on after that. He's going to die 2 years later of cerebral bleeding after a stroke. So that probably factored into that. He was never really, up to things after that. But you notice that some of his things are getting published later. So the Essay on the Origin of Languages, another really important work when you put it together with these other discourses, because it fits into his picture of how human beings develop. And then the Confessions finally gets published, as well as Dialogues, Rousseau, Judge of Jean-Jacques, which is not just an autobiography, but a vindication, right? He's saying, I get to be the judge of myself. And then Reveries of a Solitary Walker is another one of his works as well. And so, not too long after that, 1789. So 7 years after Confessions are published, 11 years after Rousseau is dead, the French Revolution begins. And the French Revolution is going to draw on some of Rousseau's key ideas. And as we were talking about before, not in a coherent way, not like they, had all of Rousseau's books together in one volume and they're like, you got to read this stuff. It's more like, we like this idea from Rousseau. The rest of it, forget about it. We'll figure that out as we go along. Because the French Revolution it's not just like one thing. It's all these different people at cross purposes, and some of them guillotine each other for not being radical enough, and then some of them get guillotined for not being radical enough, and it leads into a terror. Eventually, they have to restore order, and Napoleon comes out on top after quite a lot of mess. So before we go into some of his key ideas, I've talked quite a while at you. Any questions or comments or clarifications or concerns? No? So I want to be mindful of our time too. So I'll just tell you about a few of the big ideas. One is that Rousseau thinks that, as I mentioned, human beings evolve. We start out in a state of nature, but we're not in a state of nature. And when we do these imaginations of, well, what would it be like if we took away society, like we do in some movies or some TV shows? These zombie shows that have been around for now like 10 years, like Walking Dead. We have this terrible thing that happens. What would human beings be like if the electricity failed and we're back in a brutal condition?
Lord of the Flies.
What's that?
Lord of the Flies.
Yeah, Lord of the Flies is an imagination, although those are kids, and in a way, Lord of the Flies is sort of like sticking it to the people who are like, yeah, kids are innocent. They're all nice. They'll all get along.
It's in their natural state, they just revert to.
Yeah. So Rousseau's view is that in our natural state, we're not bad like that. As a matter of fact, we're not even very developed. We don't have language. We don't have fixed habitation. It takes a while for families to even evolve. We do have a sort of primitive sense of sympathy when we see a wounded member of our own species. You see this with other animals too. They'll, like water buffaloes will come and get the water buffalo that the crocodile has and step on the crocodile's head, or go after the lion that's got one of the wildebeests or things like that. And as we start to develop, we get more and more complex, and we get further away from the primitive, as he calls them, savages. The beginning state for human beings is savagery. And so think about really, unorganized hunter-gatherer groups. And then we start to, because of developing certain technologies, which include language, but also include agriculture and metallurgy and social organization, we begin to develop and evolve as a species. And again, not in terms of our genetics, in terms of our culture. I mean, physically, we're not as hardy, and we're not as pain resistant as primitive people are. But that's just because we grew up soft, right? And so as things start to get more and more complex, we get into a state that he calls barbarism. And in barbarism, we have almost the full panoply of human emotions developed that weren't there originally. We start to measure ourselves against each other an awful lot. We start to become very insistent on our rights and enforcing them through justice, largely through revenge, scaring off other people from messing with us. We get very interested in where we fit into the social hierarchy. We don't yet have a very well-developed political system and laws. It's sort of up to whoever's got the power to enforce this on others. And we start to lose some of that primitive sense of compassion or sympathy. It becomes much more selective. We care about those who are close to us and screw everybody else, right? That's the way he depicts human beings. That's actually probably, Rousseau gets pictured as if he thinks that savagery is the best thing, but I think he really thinks barbarism is actually better in many respects, because you got more going on, and it's a lot more interesting. Then we get civilization, and most thinkers, frame civilization as a really good thing, right? Rousseau thinks it's a catastrophe, but a necessary catastrophe that has to develop out of this, because when you live in a situation of barbarism, people screw each other over, and sooner or later people are like, this, things are too unreliable. We need to have some order here. Who can produce some order? And then Rousseau says, he's got a couple different narrative stories for how this happens, but one of them is the rich hoodwink the poor by saying, we're going to have a social contract. And in this contract, everybody's going to keep their hands off of everybody else's stuff. And there'll be an authority to enforce this. We'll call them the magistrate. We'll give them power and say, you can fine people or kill them or put them in jail or do stuff, make them labor if they won't keep their hands off other people's stuff, or if they kill other people, or they do other things that they're not supposed to do. And we'll elect some people to do this. And so they pick people originally on the basis of what Rousseau calls virtue. And, virtue means moral goodness. So, when you put together your fantasy island, let's call it, you pick the person who you think is, the most reliable or the most just. What else would we want them to have? Incorruptible, right? And you establish them. Now, Rousseau is very realistic, at least about this, it's not going to stay that way for very long, because there's other ways that we distinguish ourselves against each other that are going to inevitably start to dominate. So originally it could be like, the virtuous versus the vicious or the non-virtuous. Let the virtuous be in charge, the vicious should obey. But it starts to become a matter of rich and poor, or powerful and weak, or those who have high social status and those who have low social status. And as it turns out, if you got enough money, you can buy yourself power. You can buy yourself social status, right? Yeah. And if you're poor, you're kind of screwed, Or if you're strong, you can use that to get yourself more social status, or to get yourself, rich and strong politically, right? Getting to be in power. And so new elites come to be, and these elites are generally based not on virtue, but on all these other things. So the rich, come to think that they deserve to rule, and that society makes perfect sense. And Rousseau identifies a key characteristic of human beings that other people have pointed out too, that I think is quite true in many respects. He says, why would somebody accept being in a lower position in the hierarchy? Is it just they don't have the guts to stand up for themselves? What would be the motive that would justify being like in a middle position, having to shine somebody else's boots, put up with the noble person or the rich person's nonsense? What would it be if it's not just being cowardly?
Being taken care of.
So security, that's one thing. That's not the one thing that he points out, though. Maybe you're all too good, to relate to this. You get to kick the person who's below you. So long as you're not at the bottom of the hierarchy, you're okay being at that middle part, because you get to lord it over that poor bastard down there, Now, the guy on the very bottom, okay, he doesn't have any... I guess he can, kick the cockroach or something like that. But Rousseau thinks that this is what society becomes. And civilization becomes more and more corrupting. And so if you have that point of view, then really the best thing to do is to get away from the corrupting influences of civilization. But that's kind of a tough thing to do, because civilization also means all these things that we like, right? Like, being relatively clean. And think about our day. If somebody was to say to you, this civilization that we live in, this is all degenerate and corrupt. We should get the hell away from this. I bought an island where we can all live in savagery. You're going to have to leave your cell phone behind. What else would you have to, you're going to live in these huts, and you're going to catch fish with spears, and it's going to be a good life. We've got fire, we've got metal. And if you have any problems with the guy next to you, well, beat him up. And if he has problems with you, he'll beat you up. So you'll all be nice to each other, or you won't. I think a lot of us would be like, we might be like, yeah, that sounds great. And we're there for a weekend, and then we're like, oh man, I got to get back to civilization. And this Rousseauian motif, this goes through all the way into the 1960s, because people like the hippies read Rousseau, and they're like, yeah, we should get back to this sort of thing. This would actually be quite good, Yeah, and within a commune, how do you settle disputes? Well, you can have like everybody get together and vote, or you could have people punch each other in the nose, and settle things that way. It's not nonviolent, but it does hopefully put an end to things. Another issue that he was really concerned with was, I mentioned the general will. So Rousseau thinks that there's different kinds of freedom. There's, the freedom that we have in the state of nature. You can do anything you like, but there's almost nothing to do other than eat and drink and sleep and try not to get eaten by something else. And then there's the freedom that you have as a creature who has become intelligent enough to give him or herself rules to live by and impose those rules upon yourself. And that's kind of sort of leading in the direction of eventually Immanuel Kant and this notion of autonomy. Then we have civil or political freedom as well. And that, it involves our rights to do certain things. But those can be crimped by something that he calls the general will. And the general will is not, as he says, the will of everybody all put together, like if we vote, in a democracy. So none of our presidents have really been elected by the general will. Instead, it's this sort of much more, you could say, substantive notion of something that would really, it would be a will, it would be something that makes rules, makes decisions for the good of the totality. And so it's not just, this group who's got, 51% decides things. It's supposed to be more of a consensus. And here's where, that sounds pretty good, but here's where it gets a little bit dangerous. Rousseau says that sometimes you have to be forced to be free. And what that means is, generally all of us are, because we have, we're self-centered. We're going to be not in full accordance with the general will. Some of us will actually be out of accordance with the general will. If we are really being rational, we would see that the best thing for us is to be in accordance with the general will. And the general will should take priority over our own selfish interests. So given that, when we're being crushed beneath the general will because we don't want to do what it wants us to do through its representatives, we're just being forced to be free. We're just being forced to actually live up to the rational requirements of what it means to be a human being in a society. Now, I think you can see very quickly where this can be abused. Right? If I'm in charge and I'm the magistrate, I represent the general will. So what if you got on my bad side because we had a personality conflict? Might be tempting for me to say, those people there, they may talk a good game, but they're really not in accordance with the general will. Guillotine them, or certain classes of people, those peasants. This happened a lot in the French Revolution. They're really, quite backwards. They still believe in the Christian religion, not in the proper deism or atheism of the religion of the revolution. They don't want to let their kids go to public school because they say they have to be out in the fields. Let's guillotine them. Or, another popular way of killing people in the countryside was, let's put them on barges, chain them to the barges, and then sink the barges. There was a lot. People have actually talked about trying to view this. I don't think it's all that plausible, but there's an argument there as a type of genocide that was carried out during the French Revolution against people in the country. And so this notion of the general will, in the hands of somebody like Robespierre, it can become a very dangerous idea, and that is indeed what happened to it. Rousseau didn't think that his... Yeah, go ahead.
I don't know how I can say this the way I want to, but who was it that said this is the general will? It's like, so how did people know what it was other than it's what I
Well,
said?
that's one of the big problems with the idea, isn't it? Practically speaking, it was, so the only people that are going to talk in terms of the general will are pretty much the revolutionaries who are influenced by Rousseau. You're not going to see the nobility or the king or any of the people who are against the revolution talking about the general will. And then they're going to argue amongst themselves about what the general will really requires. And, Rousseau pictures it as like this kind of hashing out process involving argument and dialogue between the citizens. Although you do have, the magistrate who's supposed to be enforcing the general will, and sometimes would have to act. Once you've got like a crisis mentality, if you think about what happens in the French Revolution. So they, in the early stages, they take over Paris. They start, imprisoning, sometimes beating, sometimes killing the nobles, some of the clergy, people who are viewed as being in line with them. And then the reaction of the outside world is, we got to crush this. This has got to end. This is no good. because we don't want that sort of thing happening over here as well, right? So they're faced with almost like, sort of an alliance or a coalition of everybody else against them. It's really easy to get into this, we're on the right side of history, we've got to save the revolution, we've got to act now sort of mentality. And I think that turns deliberations about the general will more into whoever is able to make the case at the time that they're representing the general will, they get to decide. Mm-hmm. And in the revolution, it's slipping from one person's hands to the next. So like you could be the guy who's on top this month, but I'm gunning for you, and I find some way to show that you're not a true revolutionary, and now you're going to be beheaded, and now I'm going to be the general will guy for a while. I mean, it's really not a very practical notion, I think. It's a very powerful notion, though. And there is something really good behind it. It's supposed to be motivating us to act and set things up in accordance with a common good, not just our own selfish interests. But it's so easy to mistake our own interests or something like them for the common good, isn't it? Especially when we're doing it on the scale of a nation. And that's another point I was going to make too. Rousseau didn't think that his theories would work for France. They really wouldn't work that well for any big country like that. You need something more like a Swiss canton, a small place where you can have a republic and everybody knows each other, and they can, it's not subject to so much manipulation. I don't think that he thought his ideas would work for a place like this either. I mean, if you think about our politics, even here at the local level, it's practically impossible to meet all your constituents. Great example in Milwaukee. We have the mayor, right? So the mayor is a very important figure. And then we have the county commissioner. And the county commissioner, he's not from here. He's actually from somewhere out east. I don't New Hampshire or Boston or something like that. Chrisabelli. He's just a manager type who happened to have got himself, over here and made a case for why he should be elected, and he keeps getting elected. What's that?
And he has lots of money.
Yeah, well, that certainly doesn't hurt. And from a Rousseauian perspective, there's nothing surprising about rich people spending their money on getting political office, because then they can use that to enrich themselves. I don't know that a belly is, but he's from a Rousseauian perspective. There's no way he should be in charge of Milwaukee County. Should be somebody who's from Milwaukee. But even Milwaukee County, it's too big of an entity. I mean, think about how many people live there. We don't all know each other. Even if we all got in the same Facebook group, it would just be a cacophony. You couldn't read it, right? There'd be so many different threads. Rousseau's ideas are not all that practical for big countries like ours. And I don't think he would have thought, he probably would have liked the French Revolution in some respects, but I don't think he would have been very optimistic about it, being able to really enforce things. But they did try to put into effect some of his ideas. One of the things that he wanted to see was a new educational system, and they decided public education is the way to go, and they looked to Emile as sort of a guidebook for that. They drew the ire of Mary Wollstonecraft because they wanted the public education to be just for men, and domestic education for women, which meant basically depriving women of the rights of man. Right after Wollstonecraft had written a vindication of the rights of man, defending the revolution against Burke, she has to write a vindication of the rights of women against the French Revolution education ministry, who are drawing on Rousseau. And she attacks Rousseau very heavily in that work, in part because Rousseau had some pretty, what would you call them, pretty retrograde concepts of male-female relationships and what women were capable of. So, that was another sort of contradiction in his life. He becomes this romantic figure. Again, we're talking about these contradictions in his life and thought. I don't think that when it comes down to it, you can actually take all of Rousseau's ideas and cram them together in one systematic whole that actually works. There's going to be some junctures where you're like, well, you got to pick this, or you got to pick this, or reject them both.
Is that a reflection of the fact that he wrote over 20 years?
Well, that's a good question. I mean,
you look at it as a progression. It doesn't necessarily have to be internally consistent.
So there are thinkers who are like that, where it is a progression. With Rousseau, I don't think you can explain it away that way. There are sometimes even within the same work, you can be like, this is interesting stuff, but you just, it doesn't all fit. Like the social contract, I think is one like that. I think it's because Rousseau, he had a lot of ideas that he's working with, and in some respects, he's a deeper thinker than many of the other Enlightenment philosophers of the time. But there's something kind of undisciplined about him.
The French versus the German philosophers.
Well,
you won't find a lot of internal inconsistencies.
there were a lot of French people who were quite self-disciplined at the time. Rousseau just wasn't one of them. He wasn't disciplined in his love life. He wasn't disciplined in his personal life. He's not all that disciplined in his writings. There's a lot of rhetoric mixed in that really doesn't need to be there in some places. That sometimes I think detracts a bit from. You get cool phrases like, man everywhere is free. Man everywhere is born free, but he is in chains, right? Or sometimes you have to be forced to be free. But a lot of times when you look at the rhetoric and you pick it apart, it's sort of like pulling at those puzzles that are all these different threads together, and at the end you're like, what the hell's here? The more substantive ideas are better, I'd say. But even those, he's his notion that our sentiments or our emotional life has developed over time. I think that's a really great insight. Other thinkers, like Nietzsche coming after him, share similar insights and I think go further than Rousseau did. But Rousseau is still, he's got some great observations here and there about that. What else is there to say about his ideas in particular? I don't have too much else that I had planned to go over. But I will say this. He gets, from some places, he gets a really bad rap as being because of the general will, being a proto-fascist, being a totalitarian. And I don't think that's deserved. I think Rousseau, if he were to look at 1930s fascism, I don't think he would say, yes, this is exactly what I had in mind. But I don't think he actually offers us workable solutions in the end. I think it's more that he helps us formulate problems which he then doesn't completely solve. But he's probably more on track and realistic about human nature than many of the other Enlightenment philosophers were, because he takes account of our bad or corrupt side without necessarily bringing in Christian notions of original sin or stuff like that. He tries to explain how it is that we could go bad, and I think that's something that we do have to take into account if we want to be realistic about the situations that we find ourselves in, right? So that's all I've got. But do you have questions or other things you want to kick around?
Where do you think it comes down politically? Socialist type ideas? He's not a Marxist.
No. Socialism can mean a lot of different things. Sure. If we mean something like state control of the economy, directing economic enterprises to try to realize a sort of general level of well-being among citizens. I think he could get behind that, but he'd be one of the guys who, like Solzhenitsyn, who would be saying, yeah, this sounds really great. It's too bad that a bunch of ruthless bastards always seem to take it over, and then start throwing people in camps, But is that worse than having a king in charge who basically runs things to the benefit of the court and is part of the middle class and exploits the peasantry? Or I think he'd probably be more for that. But ideally you'd want to have like a small state, and like I said, where everybody knows everybody. You'd want people to be as independent as possible. So something like closer to like Jeffersonian yeoman farmers, where we all have our little plot of land and we trade with each other and stay out of each other's business as much as possible, but walk to our city center every month or so to debate and vote on stuff. That's what he sort of had in mind. But I mean, where do you ever see that happening other than in a few places? Like Swiss cantons, that does actually happen sometimes. Although even those can be corrupted.
It would work better in the city-states as opposed to the nation-states.
Yeah.
So when you get into like Frederick the Great consolidating Teutonic.
Oh, in Prussia, yeah. Milwaukee, at one time, was a bunch of little settlements, and they were kind of like city-states. And I don't know if you know the history of Milwaukee, but some of them would actually get into conflicts with each other. There was a war over bridges, and it was between what we now call Westtown and Easttown. And one of them was Juneauville, and the other one, somebody else whose name is in the streets. They were named after the guys. And then there was like another settlement further up, and they got into a shooting war over the bridges and whether the bridges were being used to direct commerce to one side or the other side of the river. And at one point in time, the people on the west side came over and destroyed one of the bridges. And then and this is all before Wisconsin became a state. And then they retaliated, and that's the sort of thing that are sort of like Rousseauian city-states. It doesn't always work out great because city-states will get into rivalries with each other over dumb stuff. If you think about like medieval towns, people from one town over would just hate the guts out of the people from the next town over. And every once in a while would like go into their territory with clubs and beat up some people, and then come back and beat them up. So I don't know that Rousseauian communities are actually the way to go. He's certainly an interesting figure, and he fits into his time really well, because if you think about what was going on, there's all these proposals for how are we going to fix things, because it's clear that there's all these problems and they're not being solved well, and conflicts, and people are starving. And so there's all these different ideas about, how we should fix things, and some of them actually get tried, and none of them ever seem to really work out and make people happy. Well, that's pretty Rousseauian, Maybe then the alternative is maybe we should go back to savagery. But that doesn't seem to work out too great for, think about the condition of women in savagery. Terrible, They're exploited. This is a point that Wollstonecraft made. She was like, Rousseau, you're too quick to like dismiss civilization. We're not truly civilized yet because women are still being forced into all these subservient positions. So that even like the guy who really doesn't have much to offer can at least think he's better than women. True civilization hasn't actually been reached yet. So who are you, Rousseau, to complain about it? You're jumping the gun instead of going back to savagery. So, Yeah. Rousseau's somebody who's kind of hard to bring to a good conclusion, I think. So, do you have any other questions or comments?